Hello everybody, John Robson here for the Climate Discussion Nexus with our latest readout video from our Wednesday Wake Up email newsletter. And when I say latest, you may have noticed we've gotten a little behind, and that's partly due to the fascinating trip that I took to Baku, Azerbaijan for COP29. Among other things, as a result of that trip, I do have an unused package of sanitizing wipes from Polish Airways, and what's more, I got a pair of Polish Airways socks, so I'm ready to give Justin Trudeau a run for his money. Not only that, got some mud from the fabled mud volcanoes. And also, in this readout, a hello and thank you to the folks in Chicago who have made the Windy City number 19 on our list of all-time views by city. As I say, since we're a bit behind, this video deals with a newsletter that we put out right before I left for Baku. And in that, we did comment that it was sort of weird to have this huge horde of UN functionaries, national delegates, and assorted hangers-on heading to the middle of Central Asia to denounce carbon footprints by flying internationally. And we also said it was a bit of an odd place to hold it, given that Azerbaijan is a petro state, and we fearlessly predicted that the talks would go into overtime, that exhausted delegates would finally be persuaded to sign something they really didn't understand, and that the press would then label it historic before declaring a few weeks later that it hadn't worked very well and it was critically important to do it all again. Well, that sort of happened. It sort of didn't, because the result actually was so feeble that it was hard for anyone to pretend it had been historic. But as for the petrostate, and they didn't really talk very much about that, but last time they went to Abu Dhabi, which has been using its oil revenues for half a century to try to diversify its economy, but which despite all of that still depends on hydrocarbons for about a quarter of their GDP, and they remain the world's sixth highest oil exporter, the United Arab Emirates does, after Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, the US, and Canada. Well, Azerbaijan is having a tougher go of it because they only escaped from Soviet rule in 1991. And for them, about a third of their GDP comes from oil and gas, and it accounts for 90% of its exports. They're not big on windmills in Azerbaijan. And so we weren't optimistic, and we were right not to be. Now, on another note, in the previous newsletter, we had discussed the sorry failure of voluntary carbon markets to stop carbon or work like markets. And then in this newsletter, we dissect a New York Times Climate Forward piece praising yet another initiative that will not help the climate, certainly won't stop it from changing, and if it did, would prove that the whole problem was trivial anyway. Evidently, the idea here is that some unspecified person who knows everything about everything except economics will announce just how bad a school lunch is, not just for your kid's palate, but for the entire planet. But the problem is, nobody knows enough to trace out all the impacts of any given product, as Leonard Read proved in his 1958 classic I, Pencil, which people have diligently been not reading ever since. So these econometric exercises always end up telling you pretty much what you expected and wanted to hear because somebody baked the outcome into the assumptions. In this case, as you probably saw coming, the conclusions are buy local and avoid meat. But, of course, if school lunches are really all that stand between us and climate-geddon, then either the climate is too fragile to be saved, or the problem is too trivial to worry about. So, pretty much lose-lose. Unfortunately, though, this kind of accounting is everywhere, and it quickly becomes a policy as well as an intellectual nightmare. And so in the newsletter, we quote Clean Prosperity from a July email that, quote, Alberta can be a low-carbon leader if the province strengthens its carbon credit market, end quote. But then they promptly conceded that, quote, Alberta must fix carbon credit market to ensure low-carbon growth. Oversupply of carbon credits could threaten investment in the province, end quote. Also known as, if you pay people to pay other people that you can't watch not to do something nobody could see anyway, then the list of people giving you invisible stuff in return for very visible money might lengthen quickly. Who saw that coming? Other than us, Leonard Read, and everybody else who does real economics. A short list in certain parts of the intellectual ecosystem. Sort of like people who do real science, one might add. And speaking of which, from the You Can't Make It Up file, California's Green Governor Gavin Newsom just signed an executive order commanding energy prices to fall and ordering state agencies to think of solutions he couldn't come up with because they're so obvious, while murmuring the incantation, quote, "We're taking action to address rising electricity costs and save consumers money on their bills." California is proving that we can address affordability concerns as we continue our world-leading efforts to combat the climate crisis, end quote. Right, by proving they can't by not doing any of those things, no matter how hard they try. Meanwhile, if economics doesn't do it for you, how about hysteria? Failed former Canadian Prime Minister Kim Campbell evidently offers a variety of speeches for hefty fees, including, and I quote, "We're already in World War III, examining the social and political dimensions of climate change," end quote. Plot spoiler, if you do fork out for this thing, you will discover that, quote, "Climate change has come to be recognized globally as one of the most serious challenges facing our planet," end quote. And clearly, no sum is too high to pay for that kind of insight. Or the insight that climate change is destroying agriculture. And this one is particularly important because lots of people in cities apparently know about it, while the yokels over at the Ontario publication Farmers Forum, who clearly need to spend less time outdoors and more time looking at computers, just wrote, quote, "As combines began to roll across the cornfields of southwestern Ontario, growers quickly realized that they were witnessing unsurpassed yields in specific pockets on the farm," end quote. And those pockets were the ones growing corn, which apparently didn't get the memo about storms, droughts, floods, and stuff, and instead mistakenly believed that, quote, "the quality was excellent with good weather conditions." In fact, it was so good that there were worries that the abundant corn harvest would leave stalks behind that hurt next year's soybean crop. Because as you know, with farmers, it's always something, usually connected with the weather, and always has been, even before there was climate. Meanwhile, two researchers hired by the Australian government to say that weather is bad and getting worse and it's our fault say that the weather is bad and it's getting worse and it's our fault. Indeed, quote, "Earth's climate will keep changing long after humanity hits net zero emissions. Our research shows why," end quote. Gosh, we could have saved you the trouble. It's because Earth's climate has always changed since long before humanity had any emissions, and it will keep changing long after we cease to have any, if that should happen. Thank you. Send the grant to the Climate Discussion Nexus. Oh, P.S. They also say that since net zero is futile, we must get there at all costs. Quote, "Despite the unknowns, one thing is very clear. There is a pressing need to push for net zero emissions as fast as possible," end quote. QED. Who saw that one coming when they were paid to say exactly that? Well, here we are again. Now, while some people think that school lunches can save the climate, others think we just have to fix the entire biosphere. And after lunch, world peace. The New York Times recently offered a cheerful piece on, quote, "Changing the DNA of living things to fight climate change," end quote. Or maybe not so cheerful because it was just called buying time. So redoing the entire biosphere is just a temporary solution. So I don't know, after world peace, something even bigger is apparently coming. But we ask, where is the humility? Are we really going to fix nature once and for all, having eaten the genetically engineered apple? When you look at the past history of human interventions in the biosphere and in ecology, whether deliberate or not, do you really look at them and think that we're smart and wise enough to do it right? Does our previous record really inspire that much confidence, especially if it's in the hands of governments? In the newsletter, we also note that when tragic floods hit eastern and southern Spain on October 29th, particularly Valencia, the vultures swooped with their usual grisly haste. Scientific American emailed, quote, "Catastrophic flooding kills at least 95 people in Spain. It's the dramatic reality of climate change, says European Commission President," end quote. And NBC didn't wait for bodies to be recovered from cars washed into Valencia's narrow streets before calling, quote, "While autumn storms are not uncommon in Spain, the intensity of the flooding has stunned the country. Extreme weather events like this one are becoming more common around the world, with the scientific community saying the increased episodes are most likely linked to the climate crisis," end quote. The scientific community, no less. Can someone give us its phone number so we can check on that statistic-like object, quote, "extreme weather events like this one," end quote, becoming, quote, "more common around the world," end quote? Also, the climate crisis, which is only just now happening, seems to be picking places that, ever since humans began keeping records, have been experiencing episodes of devastatingly bad weather. And an example of this phenomenon would be the Spanish city of Valencia, which was built around a river that has flooded many dozens of times over the centuries, but now is flooding due to the climate crisis that causes journalists to submit ignorant, lazy copy. Now, in our newsletters, blogs, and videos, we've repeatedly complained that the obsession with climate change is sucking all the oxygen, attention, and money out of the environmental room. And we fingered Scientific American, or scientific alarmism, or whatever they now call it, as both a symptom and a perpetrator of this problem. Science is, of course, a very broad term. Right? It encompasses chemistry, physics, biology as very large subdivisions. And then you've got, within that astronomy, paleontology, anatomy, geology, and on with logi after logi and nomi after nomi. And obviously they do sometimes intersect, including on the subject of climate. But still, why do we open virtually every single Scientific American email just knowing it will say something like, this is from Halloween, quote, "The toll of climate change on children is enormous," end quote, and we ask about this kind of stuff. Is a well-informed, well-rounded person with limited time and wide horizons really best served by having their daily brief overview of scientific news distorted by this fixation? Now, on a happier note, our Cheerful Charts series carried on to number 14 with childhood cancers, which might not sound very cheerful. But in fact, the numbers are encouraging because what they show is that the changes in our lives due to prosperity, itself driven largely by fossil fuels, include a large decline in death rates from these terrible illnesses worldwide just in the last 30 years. On the other hand, a chart that won't turn up in our series is that fertility rates around the world are crashing to levels that foretell a depopulated dystopian future. Now, some climate zealots might find the reduction or elimination of these CO2 spewing, planet wrecking human units to be a cheerful prospect, but at CNN we don't, because we like people, especially babies. Though, on the plus side, some researchers like Roger Pielke Jr. are asking what this particular trend in population means for global warming projections, because obviously the computer models take a number of things into account, and one of them has got to be the number of people involved in whatever it is that we're doing that creates carbon dioxide. And apparently the IPCC has now abandoned its off-the-scale scam known as RCP 8.5 for so-called SSP projections, but many of them are just as impudently ridiculous. Though there's also one rather low projection, which is known as SSP 2-4.5. And alarmists tend to ignore that one because they think it foretells far too few emissions. But in a recent Substack, Pielke Jr. points out that even SSP 2-4.5 includes population growth numbers that are now likely far too high. So, the upside of the empty cradle is that we meet our Paris targets without costly and destructive climate policies. On the other hand, Paris is associated with romance, and romance can lead to babies, so this one's win-win. And if you're into sowing a few wild oats, the CO2science.org archive tells us that Avena fatua L, or wild oat, has managed to spread around the world, and it's considered an invasive plant in many places. But plants will be plants, and studies show that it gets bigger and bolder with more CO2, so it turns out that carbon has a wild side too. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and obviously I did get back alive from Baku.